Hi guys, this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today I am back with my series called You Don't Need to Buy New Paints Because You Have Paints at Home. This is a series where I do my best to reverse engineer popular granulating color mixes that I see online or that I might already own in my collection and try to recreate them by using paints I already own. Sometimes I'm able to get pigment for pigment matches, and other times I have to find suitable substitutions to get as close to that color and the characteristics of that paint as possible. The joke is that buying art supplies and using art supplies are two separate hobbies, and I am trying to do better at utilizing what I have. And so that is one of the main reasons for this. But I also want to get better at seeing if a color is going to be a good fit for me before I buy a tube of it. And by being able to recreate some of these convenience mixes at home, I can get a feel for how this color would behave and act and decide if it is a good fit before I commit to buying an entire tube of it. And the final reason is by recreating these colors, I'm better understanding pigments and how they work with each other, and in turn, better understanding my watercolors and becoming a better watercolor artist. Today, we are doing a deep dive into Undersea Green by Daniel Smith and recreating it. And I would say that this paint has an almost cult-like level following. I first bought it over 10 years ago on a whim. I hadn't heard anything about it, but I just wanted a better earthy, mossy green color, so I bought it and instantly fell in love. And now I see it on everyone's recommended list for must-buy colors from Daniel Smith. On the side of a tube of paint from Professional Watercolors, it will list what pigments make up the color. On the Daniel Smith one, it even names what each of those pigments are. And we could see that this paint is made up from 3 different colors. First up is our PB29, also known as ultramarine blue. This pigment plays 2 roles in this mix. One, it is one of the primary colors used to create green. So you have blue and yellow creating green. And 2, this is our source of granulation. And it's our only source of granulation. So that plays an important role when trying to recreate the color. Next up is our nickel azo yellow, also known as PY150. And this color is super transparent. And that is something to keep in mind when we're trying to find suitable substitutions, because most yellows aren't transparent like this one, and that will play a role in trying to recreate it. Our third and final color is quinacridone rust or quinacridone burnt orange, also known as pigment PO48. This is another very transparent, strongly pigmented color, and something to keep in mind that blue and orange are opposite colors, and so they tend to neutralize each other. So keep that in mind when we're trying to recreate this mix. So let's start off by recreating this paint by using exact pigment matches. So I have my 3 tubes of single pigment paints, and I'm laying them out, and I'm going to mix it up and do my best to recreate that color from our Undersea Green. I chose a middle of the road ultramarine blue. I own a lot of ultramarine blues, but I chose one that is nicely granulating and strongly pigmented, but isn't as granulating as, say, a French ultramarine. And then I chose the only nickel azo yellow that I have in my collection, which is a Daniel Smith one. And then I own 2 tubes of paint with the PO48 pigment. I own one from Daniel Smith and I own one from M. Graham. I chose to use the M. Graham one just to reinforce that idea that you don't have to have the exact brand of paint to recreate a color, that you need to pay attention to the pigment information to recreate it. So now I am swatching out that color, and one thing you'll notice throughout this video and other color matching videos like this is I might swatch a color and then go back and tweak and adjust it, and that's because I'm doing this by eye, and one, you can't really tell a color completely by how it looks on the palette. And 2, I don't know the exact ratios that they used to formulate this color in the lab. So I'm just going by feel. But here is the exact pigment match, and it obviously is a very close recreation. So now we're going to jump into the more chaotic part of all of this and figure out what swaps and substitutions you can use to try and recreate this color using what you have. First up is our quinacridone gold, and one interesting thing about this color is it already has 2 of the 3 pigments we need. It has PO48 and PY150. So in theory, we could just take this color, add our ultramarine blue, and we would have an exact match, right? Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that because I can't control the individual amounts of yellow and orange in these mixes using this quinacridone gold because they're already pre-mixed. It's similar to having salt and pepper already mixed together on the table. So it makes it so I can't add one without adding the other. So if I had a piece of chicken and I wanted to add more salt to it, I run the risk of making it too peppery while adding that salt, or vice versa. I might want to add more pepper to make it more spicy, and I run the risk of adding too much salt and making it too salty in that process. That is what I had happen with this. I couldn't add more orange to it without adding more yellow, and that was affecting being able to get an exact match because I was limited in that aspect. So here is that mix all swatched out, and don't worry, at the end of the video we will compare all of the swatches so that you can see exactly how close I was able to get with the various substitutions. So let's see what we can do if we don't have pigment PY150. Well, I tested out a bunch of different yellows and I found the closest substitution was the PY129 pigment, or our green gold pigment. This color got us the closest to the nickel azo in terms of how it interacts and behaves with the other pigments. Remember, our nickel azo yellow was a highly transparent staining color, and that was something I needed to have when recreating this mix. And I found that this one was the closest. Some of the other colors were too cool toned, or they weren't transparent enough, and it was just really difficult to find the right mix without it being too orange. And this color kind of rode that line. It is a little bit more green than the nickel azo yellow, but I was able to counteract that by just using a little bit more of our quinacridone rust. So here you can see it has a lot of the same characteristics in terms of transparency, granulation. Like, it was able to keep that pretty steady across the board. And one of the things you'll notice is that I'm doing this kind of gradient in these swatches. And that's because sometimes I found when I'm doing these substitutions, they might look similar in concentration, but when it's diluted out, that similarity disappears. So how do we substitute for PO48 or the burnt orange color? Well, I found you have to do a combination. Our pyrrole orange, or PO71, combined with our phthalo blue red shade, or PB15, together they created kind of a burnt rust color that made a really good substitution. And part of why this combination works is because both colors are highly transparent. So then again, we are replicating some of the characteristics of the color we're substituting for. For this swatch I'm showing you, I am also using our yellow substitution because I wanted to see how well our transparent orange and the phthalo blue worked with our green gold color. So this one's kind of crazy because the only original pigment from the Undersea green is the ultramarine blue. The others are all different colors. And so I wanted to see if I could still get close to that Undersea green with all of these substitutions in place. And I was really pleasantly surprised with how both substitutions worked well in recreating this color. It was still transparent and beautiful. It wasn't too muddy or it didn't feel overworked at all. And it had that transparent vibrancy that we know and love about watercolor. So this was a really, really pleasant surprise for me, and I can't wait to show you all the side-by-side comparisons so we could look a little bit more at the nuance of these mixes. So let's do one more swatch just for good measure, because pigment PO48, or our quinacridone burnt orange, and our transparent orange are both not super common colors on most people's palettes. And so I wanted to see if there was something that is more commonly found on paint palettes that would be a suitable replacement in a pinch. And that would naturally be burnt sienna, PBR 7. And this color ended up being quite a good substitution for the quinacridone burnt orange or quinacridone rust because it is a very similar color in terms of like chroma and undertones. The pigment does have some differences because burnt sienna is not as transparent as quinacridone colors are, and it is a granulating color. So those are just something to keep in mind, but you can get a very close result. And because we want granulation within our mixes for this color, it still worked out beautifully. One thing I did use, and this could just be because of the burnt sienna I chose to use versus a different brand, I did find I needed to use just a tiny bit of the phthalo blue when mixing it to get it as close as possible to the Undersea green. And just as a word of caution, the phthalo blue is a really, really strong pigment. So be very careful with how much you add because sometimes you use too much phthalo blue and not enough ultramarine blue. And that makes it so the paint doesn't granulate in the end because the ultramarine blue is really our only granulating color. So just be careful, and I'll show you examples of that when we look at these swatches side by side. Here is a reminder of what Undersea green looks like. And you can see as it gets diluted out and more water is added to it, you can see that granulation and the separation of the blue and the orange and yellow. So just something to keep in mind. Now here is my first recreation of it using the exact pigments, even though I'm using different brands. And I would say that this would probably benefit from using something a little bit more like a French ultramarine blue, just because it granulates a little bit more, but it is very close. I will say I used a touch too much yellow in recreating it, and that is one of the downsides of mixing a color by hand versus having it out of a tube. You just don't have the same consistency that a factory can when creating a color. Now here is our second color. This is where I substituted our azo yellow with green gold, and this one turned out quite close. You can see we got the nice granulation, similar undertones when diluted out, and it is still a beautiful color. So I really liked how this one ended up. And then for our final one where we are only doing one swap, this is where I'm using our transparent orange and the phthalo blue red shade to replace the quinacridone orange. And this one again is really close. I might have used a touch too much orange and possibly too much of the azo yellow on it, but it is really close. Now you can see there is a little bit less granulation on it than on the Undersea green, but it is a decent substitution. Now here is the swatch using the quinacridone gold, and this is actually my least favorite out of the bunch. And that's because I could get it to be a really close match in the lighter values, but whenever I tried to darken up the value of it and get it more concentrated, it always pulled too blue. I couldn't get enough of that quin gold and the ratios of the orange and the yellow just right to get it to match. So this one's probably my least favorite. For the last two, they're going to be double substitutions where the only true original pigment is the ultramarine blue. This one is where I'm using the burnt sienna and the phthalo blue red shade along with the green gold. And this is where I can tell I used a little too much of the phthalo blue in the mix because it doesn't granulate as much. And in theory, it should granulate more because our burnt sienna is also a granulating color. So just something to keep in mind when you are thinking about your ratios when you are mixing it. This one is granulating a little bit better. And this is the one where I use the transparent pyrrole orange and the phthalo blue red shade along with our green gold. This one could have used a little bit more yellow and maybe a touch more orange in recreating it to just get a closer match. And whether you decide to recreate Undersea green on your palette by just mixing or you want to buy it, this is still a great exercise in learning how to utilize the paints you already have. This process helps you understand color and pigment on a deeper level. You learn how to utilize the paints you already have and what things can substitute for something else. You also learn the intricacies of a pigment and why you might choose to use one paint or another, depending on what look you're trying to achieve. It also better helps you understand convenience mixes and how to use them while also creating harmony within your painting. So if you're going to use Undersea green, but you also need to choose a blue for your subject matter that you're painting, well, maybe you opt to choose an ultramarine blue because that's also in the Undersea green. And by utilizing the same blue, you're going to get more harmony and more vibrancy when you mix those colors together. So that is it for our video today. If you like it, please hit the like button. And if you have any questions, please leave them down below. And I will see you guys next time. Bye.